I'm Kim Brimmer, your host today for another edition of Bova News, keeping you up to date on the cattle industry's latest in technology, management, genetics, and more. Dairy producers are in the midst of another unique financial situation, with high milk prices coupled with high feed costs. There are a number of domestic and global issues that have led to this current situation, and it appears that this volatility will continue for some time. Today, we'll hear from a nutritionist to tell us how we got to where we are today and what the future holds in terms of making sense of the current dairy market. Our presenter today is Dr. Enrique Schcolnik, a veterinarian working with Progressive Dairy Solutions in California. Dr. Schcolnik emphasizes herd health programs, fresh cow performance monitoring, reproductive troubleshooting, and develops management systems and people. His passion lies with cows and people, focusing on the areas of dairy efficiency, reproduction, employee training, and nutrition. Dr. Schcolnik leads Progressive Dairy Solutions Incorporated Advanced Dairy Training Schools. Welcome, Dr. Schcolnik.
Thank you, Kim. Good morning, everybody. So a little bit of background on myself that may be relevant to today. I grew up in Argentina and came to the United States when I was 19. But also my great-grandfather was born in Odessa, Ukraine. So my family has been following the grain and cattle countries here for the last few generations anyway. But yeah, thank you for having me this morning. I've been asked to cover managing feed costs in a rapidly changing world environment. And in the last 22 years as a dairy professional, and last 14 years as a dairy nutritionist, I've seen these changing environment accelerate year over year. In the current environment, we have a high cost of production, high milk price with high milk component pricing. And we're also facing some challenges in feed availability, especially out here in California, which now we call it the island of California because the logistical challenges here to get feed out here have been tremendous. So when we talk about high cost production, we're seeing this both in non-feed related expenses and also in feed costs. I'm going to focus on the feed cost side of the equation. So just as a general outline, when you look at we look at feed costs per hundredweight of milk production, typically we see feed expenses around 60% of total operating expenses, and non-feed related expenses at 40%. Labor typically is around 8%, and other itemized expenses between 1% and 3%. So if you look at this, feed expenses are around 60%. If we do focus on that side and do a good job managing those, we can have a large impact on dairy margins. So only a year ago, we had our high-performing dairies. They could make 100 pounds of milk at $15 per hundredweight. And looking at breaking that down between feed and non-feed expenses, $9.50 of that $15 was feed-related expenses, with $5.50 on non-feed related expenses. Currently, we're at $19 approximately for, depending on what part of the country, but $19 per hundredweight on all expenses, $12 on feeds, and $7 for non-feed related expenses. So you can see there's been a very, very steep increase in cost of production. Again, last year, we had milk prices around $17 with a cost of production of $15 for the best performing dairies, margins of $2. Currently, cost of production $19, milk price at $23 or even $26 a hundredweight, depending on your components, with a margin of $4. So even though our cost of production has gone up significantly, our margins have also gone up. And yeah, for some people, it's hard to put things in context. A lot of people focus on the expense side, um, and forget to look at margins. But margins have actually gone up for most dairy producers. So living in this high cost, high income world, some of the key strategies are to maximize energy corrected milk hundredweight sold per dairy unit, not necessarily milk per cow. Also, we want to focus on not overfeeding or underfeeding nutrients. We want to make sure that we have a tight control on feeds and feeding, and also maximize health and reproduction. So when we talk about energy corrected milk, hundredweights, is very important because in a high cost of production world, high labor, high feed costs, maximizing hundredweight sold per dairy unit decreases cost per hundredweight on the expense side. So basically, just having more marginal milk can really help wash away some of those expenses that we have. So, for example, if you have a not fee related cost of $6.50 per hundredweight, over 100 pounds of milk, and you produce 110 pounds of milk, your non-feed related expenses can be $5.90. So basically, you had a 10% increase in your milk production per dairy unit, and you wash away some of the fixed expenses or even some of your feed related expenses by 10%. So you increase your margins by 10%. Also, not overfeeding nutrients or underfeeding nutrients. At dairies, we can divide nutrients into protein and amino acids, carbohydrates, vitamins and minerals, and fats. And when we talk about protein and amino acids, I consider protein in most cases as the most commonly overfed nutrient. Protein grains can comprise 30% of total diet costs, so they have a significant impact on your total cost of feeding cows. And it's important to know that cows have a requirement for amino acids, not necessarily protein. So as nutritionists, we need to stop balancing for protein levels. There's some strategies. If you balance for amino acids, we can feed some supplemental synthetic amino acids or other feeds that are rich in amino acids and significantly lower your total protein in the diets with targeting that 30% of total diet costs. We can have a large impact on your total feed costs. And important to know that monitoring milk urea nitrogens to see if you're minimizing overfeeding of proteins is important. That just gives you a rough idea. If you monitor milk urea nitrogens, they're basically a waste product of feeding protein. The cow will eliminate those in the milk. And if they're high, basically you can tell that you're overfeeding protein. So that's something worth taking a look at. On the carbohydrate side, carbohydrates are fed so that rumen bacteria can drive production of energy, and also production of bacterial protein. And these nutrients are in turn transformed into milk. Overfeeding carbohydrates can result in an unhealthy rumen environment, which can kill the very bacteria that are manufacturing nutrients for milk production. So nutritionists balance diets so that there is no excesses or shortages. It's similar to maybe to use a kind of a rough example. If you have a car with a carburetor and you open that carburetor too much, and you'll be wasting some of that energy won't be turned into power. And same thing if you shut down the carburetor too much, not feeding enough carbohydrates, then your engine will underperform. And then another nutrient that is very important to cows and to the bacteria in the rumen are vitamins, minerals, and buffers. They typically only comprise about 3 to 4% of total diet costs. So they have a very small impact on total diet costs, but a very high impact as far as rumen health and efficiency and cow health. So we want to make sure that we look at these nutrients not as feed additives. They are actually required nutrients, both for bacteria and for the cow. So we want to make sure that we fulfill the requirements of both biological systems, the bacteria in the rumen and the cow herself. And so keep in mind that all feeds, both forages and grains, bring in vitamins and minerals into the diets. So we will have a different supplementation need for different diets at different dairies, depending on how much forage and how much grains you feed, and also different parts of the country. Forages will have different mineral contents. So we have to customize to be effective. We have to customize vitamins and minerals and buffer supplementation. So last thing about vitamins and minerals and buffers, if you look at this graph on right in the middle, you have a high performing dairy. We want to make sure that we supplement vitamins and minerals for high performance, that we maximize rumen efficiency and feed efficiency. If you go too much to the left, then you will sacrifice some health, reproduction, feed efficiency. If you go too far to the right, then you can get into some toxicity situations, and we don't want to do that. And then the last nutrients that I wanted to discuss briefly is fats. Fats can have a great impact on milk components and reproductive efficiency. And remember that we get paid on energy-corrected milk. Therefore, balancing for this nutrient can have a huge impact on income and efficiency. Butter right now is over $3. So we're actually, for the last 3 months, butter has taken over as a driver for milk income. Previous to that, the last 2 years, protein had been our top earner. So it's important to balance correctly for fat levels in the diet. Using some bypass fats can really help us drive butterfat and components. Also, the positive effects of these fats on reproduction are very important to maintain low days in milk in the herd, and that helps us tremendously with feed conversion. Cows that are shorter days in milk are much more efficient at turning feed into milk. So again, to recap, living in a high-cost, high-income world, we want to maximize energy-corrected milk, 100 weights sold per dairy. I know it's fun to brag about how much milk we get per cow, but really it's how many 100 weights we sell per dairy unit that it's important, not necessarily milk per cow. Also, do not overfeed nutrients or underfeed nutrients. We want to have well-balanced diets. We want to maximize health and reproduction, and we want to have a tight control of feeds and feeding. And so we're going to talk about tight control of feeds and feeding here for a few minutes. So feeds and feed management, we want to minimize running out of feeds. This has been a challenge, especially lately with logistics. We want to minimize forage and grain shrink, and we want to have excellent feed bunk management. So running out of feeds and making substitutions is one of the most common causes of fluctuating intakes in production at dairy. We want to practice inventory risk management by having several sources of feed or feeds for each nutrient. If we, again, divide nutrients into proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, we want to make sure that we have several sources of proteins like soybean meal, canola, distillers, and the more we have of those, if we run out of one, we can make an appropriate substitution and, and not have a fluctuating production or health issues. Same thing with carbohydrates. We do have several sources of carbohydrates that we can use. We can use raw corn, whey, liquid whey. We can use some other products like pea starch, etc. And the more commodities we have, the better we can manage that risk of running out of feed and not being able to cover some of the nutrient needs of the cows. And same thing with fats. We can have a couple different sources of fats at dairies and minimize the risk of not having that nutrient available. When we talk about logistics, communication with the feeding team is extremely important. Communicating that part of that team is the feed supplier, the actual feeder, the feed cows of the dairy owner or manager that is ordering those feeds from the feed supplier, and of course the nutritionist that is helping make those substitutions to make sure that the nutrients stay the same day in and day out. So make sure that you have alternative diets already formulated and loaded into the feed management software. That way, the feeder, when they're out of a certain feed, he can just go to an alternative recipe and make sure that we don't skip a beat and we get the cows what they need to have a consistent milk production. And another factor in feeding cows and feed management is minimizing shrink of both forages and grains. We want to make sure for forages that we pack and cover our piles, and we usually say about 50% of our shrink we can minimize through packing and covering, and the other half, the other 50%, we can minimize it during feed out. So having good practices for both is extremely important. You can clearly see here the difference between how the left forage pile is or bag is managed versus the right, and this is obviously for the feed out. And the one on the right, we're really doing a good job on minimizing shrink during the feed out. The one on the left, we're losing a lot of feed there, a lot of nutrients. Same thing with big piles, having a good strategy, good practices to minimize shrink. We can have a huge impact on feed costs. Minimizing shrink also in the grains, practicing first in, first out. You can see here that these bays have some old loads of feed behind some new loads, and those old loads that are behind the new loads are losing nutrients every day. So we want to make sure that we pull those old loads out before we bring in a new load of grain in there. Other sources of grain shrink, when we drive around with a bucket loader full of $580 soybean meal, and we hit those potholes and we start sprinkling that expensive feed all over the yard. And maybe at the end of the day we sweep that and we feed it to somebody, but maybe it goes over to the heifers that don't need that extra protein, or goes to a group of cows that really have no benefit from getting that extra soybean meal. So we want to make sure that our feed yards are nice and even, and that we also don't overload our buckets. That's a really good practice to make sure that we teach the feeders to not overload the buckets, and also to have the largest bucket possible. That makes feeding more efficient as well. So put the biggest bucket that you can on your loader. Some people say, well, we can put this size of bucket without voiding the loader warranty. And maybe once the warranty is out, maybe we can put something even larger. But that's an important, the size of the bucket is really important to minimize grain shrink and make feeding more efficient. And then lastly, feed bump management. We want to make sure that cows have feed available 24 hours a day. Remember that each individual cow eats in a limited area of feed bunk. It's been shown in studies and repeated in many studies that cows eat in about 8 stanchions. And if there's no feed in front of those 8 stanchions, they will not move to a different area of the feed bunk to find feed. So this just limits intakes, potentially limits peak production, and this will limit income or feed costs. Again, when we look at feed bunks, we want to make sure that our feed bunks look like the left feed bunk with feed available 24 hours a day, and that we don't look like at the right side where cows are obviously out of feed. So again, recapping, living in a high cost, high income world, we want to make sure that we maximize energy corrected milk, hundredweights sold per dairy unit, not necessarily milk per cow. We do not want to overfeed nutrients or underfeed nutrients. We want to maximize health and reproduction by making sure that we have well-balanced diets. And we want to have tight control of feeds and feeding. Thank you. Any questions? I'm sure we'll be able to answer after all the presentations.
Thank you, Dr. Schcolnik. You alluded to this. Can you explain the supply issues that you're dealing with?
Yes. Yeah, logistics have been a nightmare here in California. That's what more and more people find themselves calling California the island of California. But yeah, we just as an example, a few weeks ago, we had an entire train of corn that was stuck somewhere, I think in South Dakota, for weeks, and they couldn't move them down the rail. From what I understand, that the rails have the equipment, but they don't have the people to move them. And same thing to unload the grains. Just they don't have the personnel to unload them. So sometimes rail cars are sitting full and not being able to get them onto trucks. So that's just some of the examples. A couple of weeks ago, a train of corn didn't make it into the ethanol plant. So the ethanol plant was trying to get corn from some of the same sources that where we get our raw corn from. So that's just some of the examples. In Nevada, we had some rail cars of pea starch that weren't making it there into Nevada, into Fernley. So just tremendous logistical issues. Yeah.
You make a good case as to not running out of inventory. What should producers consider when they're looking for all these alternative and likely cheaper feed ingredients? And how do they monitor quality along the way?
Excellent question. Yeah, so some of these alternatives are byproducts. And now historically, we see some of these byproducts that may be more inconsistent. You know, if we're looking for a source of starch, for example, bakery, you know, they're mixing with bakery, they're mixing different ingredients to make up that starch byproduct. So we have to do our due diligence and test these byproducts on a regular basis to make sure that we're formulating those byproducts correctly into our diets, and that also that we're pricing them correctly, right? We may be getting a $20 discount under corn to get bakery, but if it's not meeting the specs that they're telling us, then it may not be a value. So So we, putting some, making sure that we hold our suppliers accountable, the suppliers of those byproducts accountable to what they're telling us their specs are. It's important, and double checking.
Is there any regionality to the high feed cost situation?
Yeah, so especially on the forage side, in California, our forages are extremely expensive in the last 12 months. So, we're replacing a lot of those forages with byproducts as well. We find ourselves really thinking outside the box to formulate diets. We're driving high milk components. Cows are healthy, but if somebody, would have shown me some of the diets that we're feeding today a year ago, I would have probably would have said, "You're crazy. You can't do this." But we're figuring out. We're formulating diets based on nutrients, making sure that the cows have enough fiber in the diet, and where that fiber is coming from. If it's quality fiber, it's doable. But yeah, then you go to the Midwest, and the forages there are a lot cheaper relative to California. And yeah, those diets don't look as goofy or crazy as our diets here in California.
My thanks to all of you today for joining us and sharing your invaluable expertise and experience. Don't forget to subscribe to the Bova News channel on YouTube, find our Bova News podcast on your favorite listening platform, or find more information at bovanews.com. Thanks for tuning in with us today, and we'll see you next time on another edition of Bova News.